Now let's take a look at ride height. We're going to use those comparison measurements we took in the first video that measured the distance from the ground up to some position on the card. We used the pinch weld. And now we're going to take the ride height measurement from those exact positions for comparison only. And we'll compare those two values from what we measured initially with the tires on to what we measure with the hub stands on. Since the tires have squished, tire pressure changes, tire wear, all those things affect its static loaded radius. However, the hub stands are very stiff, and so they won't have that deflection. So there will be a difference in ride height between the hub stands and the tires. There's two ways to compensate for that, and we'll get into it, but let's go ahead and take these ride height measurements. All right, so here's our first view of the ride height gauge. We haven't deployed the gas spring yet, so it's still in its home position. But here you can see the laser line from the laser leveling system showing on one of the graduations for ride height. So on the back is a little pull pin, and that's going to release the gas spring. So we'll pull that pin. Make sure the ride height gauge is touching the pinch weld where we originally took our comparative measurement. And if you look right here, we're on about 119 millimeters. So we're going to use that as our comparative measurement for the front right. Now we'll go through and do that for all four corners. Then we'll get an overarching picture of the difference between the tires and the precision hub stands, and then the options that we have to compensate for that. And then to put the ride height gauge back in its home position, you just push down, and it clicks right into place. So now we're going to head back to the setup sheet and add our comparative measurements next to the measurements we initially took with the car and the tires. So scrolling down on the setup sheet, here's what we've got. Initially, here were our measurements for right front 115 and 112. And so if you compare those to what we're measuring with the ride height gauge at the same location, we get 119 and 116, which is a 4 millimeter difference equal side to side. So that's good. And then on the right rear, we have 110 with a 126 millimeter on the ride height gauge. And then the left rear is 112 and 128. So both of those equal a 16 millimeter difference. So with the 16 millimeter difference and the 4 millimeter difference, we have two options. We can either A, adjust the height of the precision hub stands to match the static loaded radius of the tires. So that would go in, and then we would make, so if it was a 16 millimeter change on radius, we'd want to make a 32 millimeter change on diameter. So we'd go in and make a 32 millimeter height setting change in the rear and an 8 millimeter height setting change in the front. Or we can just compensate for that when we take our ride height measurements, knowing that the difference is 4 millimeters and 16 millimeters respectively. The only thing to caveat this with is if you're corner balancing the car, you need to make sure that you adjust the hub stands to match the static loaded radius, as that could affect the corner balancing. So let's get to setting ride height. So right here we're in front of the front suspension. There's this flat milled location for ride height, and they have a rubber plug in there. So what we do is we remove this plug, and you can just get your finger under there to get it out. There we go. And now this whole area is open to us. So we had moved the ride height gauge underneath it. We release the gas spring, goes up, and it touches. So now we've got the ride height gauge extended in position on the proper ride height measurement location. And we measure down, and we are right at 110 millimeters. And we know there is a 4 millimeter difference in the front. So we're actually 4 millimeters different than 110. And we know that the precision hub stands measure 4 millimeters high. So in this case, our 110 millimeter ride height setting is really 106 millimeters. So the factory specification for GT Force, which we'll copy here, is 109. So we're going to raise the front right 3 millimeters. But we're going to go ahead and check the front left as well before we make that movement to make sure we can utilize the same movement back and forth. Okay, so we take the spanner wrench and we need to tighten it, which there's weight on the car, so this can be used a little more force. And we also can see the gunk build up. This is from anti-seize and just road grime. So some recommendations: you can wipe it off with like a microfiber, or wear gloves also helps. It's kind of the nature of the beast with coilovers and anti-seize. So let's raise it up, and we can watch the ride height measurement change as we do it. and we're targeting 113 millimeters, which is 109, the factory GT4 spec, plus 4 millimeters of offset for the precision hub stands. There we go, 113. And as you can see, the coilover itself rotated a little bit while we were making these measurements, making these adjustments. So I'm gonna take the top one for the spring and just rotate it back. There we go, back into its position. So we'll double check. Yes, we're at 113. We've got everything set up. Now what we'll do is the other side, and then once the other side's complete, we'll put the strut clamp bolt back in and torque it to spec. Next, let's move to the rear and check out the rear of the car. So we got both fronts set to 113 millimeters, which is really 109 millimeters of ride height. And now we're going to work on the rear. So this is the right rear of the car. You can see that we have the ride height gauge and the ride height measurement location, and it's showing right at 136 millimeters. So we want 130 per Porsche's GT4 specs. We're 16 millimeter difference, so 130 plus 16 is 146. So we need to raise about 10 millimeters to get to where we want. So we're gonna loosen up the clamp bolts, remove the sway bar, linkage, and then raise up the coilover with its adjustment spanner nut. And there we go, 146. So now we're gonna go to the other side, do the same thing. We'll tighten everything up and torque it to spec. And then next up, we'll move on to caster camber. And now ride height is set. So we set it in all four corners, 109 in the front, 130 millimeters in the back. And then after we set all four corners, we went through and double checked all of them. And then we went and put the little rubber plugs back in the front ride height measurement locations. So just to recap of everything we've talked about in this video series so far, we talked about the components in the Precision Hub Stands Porsche Pro kit. We talked about setting the height on the Precision Hub Stands, installing the Precision Hub Stands, positioning the leveling pads, leveling and putting them in the same plane with the laser leveling system. And now we've talked about setting ride height. In the next video, we're going to talk about setting caster and camber. Thanks.